All right. Our second speaker is Scott Smith. He's going to present now public transit services for elderly mobility. Please welcome.
Okay, thank you. I think I have a little bit different title here, Evaluating and Improving Public Transit Accessibility Using GTFS Data. Together with June, and we had the assistance of two graduate students who are not here today, but were very valuable in this effort. We really had three research objectives as part of this research. One was to model public transit employment accessibility for people with varying mobilities. So instead of just looking at it in terms of the private automobile, I'll talk about some tools and methods that are used now for getting a more nuanced picture of public transit accessibility, and we use GTFS, OpenStreetMap, and OpenTripPlanner. I'll talk more about those. And also, once we have a better understanding of public transit accessibility, how can that be used to maximize infrastructure investments? And I'll be using a Kalamazoo County case study for this research. There's a third part that I won't be talking about today, which is trying to understand the degree to which improvements in public transit infrastructure, especially the accessibility of the, say, bus stops with regard to ADA compliance and so on, to what degree does that improve overall transit ridership? And then I'll talk a little bit about the next steps building on this research. So the study really was inspired by a report that was published a couple of years ago by the University of Minnesota, Owen and Levinson, this report called Access Across America. And it looked at 46 metro areas across the United States and measured public transit employment accessibility. And what was interesting about the report was first you're able to compare several metro areas and kind of the general trends in public transit, but also the way they measured transit accessibility was more rich and robust than previous measures. This was in that they were able to use the actual schedules of the fixed transit services and so on. So there's you can see here in this chart, they're looking at time that the person is leaving from their origin, how many jobs, cumulative job opportunities do they have available to them. So there are a lot of fluctuations throughout the day. This is just a 2-hour peak AM period, depending on when you leave. And you can imagine that this is really a result of the scheduling of a fixed route transit system interacting maybe with other systems, as well as multimodal, in that every transit trip begins with walking, so walking to the station and so on. So it's a richer understanding of public transit employment accessibility at fine geographic scale. So they're actually reporting this at the census block scale, which is the finest level of geography provided by the U.S. Census Bureau. So we wanted to do something similar. That report, it made extensive use of GTFS, which is the General Transit Feed Specification that is used, if you do a Google search, for example, on Google Maps in a route planner, and you can get your route by private automobile, or you can choose the bus icon. And the bus icon uses the GTFS information. So a lot of service providers across the world and in the United States are using this system to publish their transit schedules and so on. In fact, at last count, there are over 1,000 systems. So we wanted to use this and what's interesting, so this is the data that's input that is part of the GTFS, and some of them are required to be included in, say, the Google Trip Planner, and some of them are optional, including the wheelchair accessible and the wheelchair boarding parameters. Right now, there's only, according to a 2014 study, only 3% of agencies are using those or populating those parameters, wheelchair accessible. In other words, is the vehicle that you are using does it allow at least one wheelchair user? Does it accommodate one wheelchair user? And also wheelchair boarding is whether the public transit stop itself, is there a boarding platform? Is there connectivity to a sidewalk? It includes that information. And what's interesting is that the report that I mentioned before, the Owen and Levinson report, did not look at public transit employment accessibility for people that may have mobility limitations. In other words, they're not using the data about wheelchair boarding and wheelchair accessibility. So we wanted to include that in our research. How do transit employment accessibility outcomes differ for people who have additional infrastructure needs? Because we know that disability is not only one's physical individual mobility, but also what the environment offers. So your disability can actually go down if you have more infrastructure that is accommodating, right? And what we found is that, I mentioned that our case study was Kalamazoo County, and there's one public transit system there, fixed route system, the Kalamazoo Metro system. And unfortunately, they didn't have the wheelchair boarding and wheelchair accessibility, but they had just in their GTFS information. However, they did just recently conduct a full review of all their public transit stops, and they were reviewed in terms of their compliance with public right-of-way standards and recommendations along these 10 parameters. I'm not going to go through them all, but they have to do with, you know, the surface, the cross slopes, and so on, whether it's accommodating, whether or not there's a boarding platform, and so on. And what that survey found was that only 7% were fully compliant with PROAG standards. 7% of their bus stops, 52 out of 751. 72% did not have a boarding platform for wheelchairs. 31% did not have connectivity to a sidewalk. So you can imagine a lot of challenges. This is a view of just a few of the bus stops. The upper right picture showing no connectivity nor boarding platform. The one in the upper left does have, it's not aesthetically pleasing, but it does comply with some more than other, although there are some gaps there in the sidewalk. The bottom one showing the board, a place, but not necessarily 8 foot by 5 foot, which is what you're looking for a boarding platform. So these are the compliant bus stops within Kalamazoo County in blue here. These are the non-compliant bus stops within Kalamazoo County. Now, the question that we have is, well, if you start to measure employment accessibility, how does, if you consider whether or not it, is accommodating with wheelchair boarding and wheelchair accessibility, how does that actually affect employment accessibility outcomes? So we also needed information on jobs, where jobs are located across the county. And that is available at the census block level as well through the longitudinal origin destination employment survey. I think that's the LOADS is the acronym for that. And that's available now on an annual basis. So this is job density in Kalamazoo County, with the red areas having the most dense areas for employment. And then using the same scale, so the maps are comparable in terms of thematically, is worker density by place of residence. So we have about 97,800 workers or so in Kalamazoo County, and you have, it's more spread out than the job opportunities. But essentially the data are available for doing the employment accessibility. So we began with OpenStreetMap, which provided the network data, the Tiger Line shapefiles, which gives us the geographies by census blocks, the loads data for the employment and the worker locations, the GTFS information that was improved by the graduate students to include the wheelchair and accessibility and so on based on the survey. That was put into Open Trip Planner, which allows for batch processing of accessibility measures. We automated that using Python scripts. And then the results, we could begin to look at job accessibility, a spatially weighted version of job accessibility where you're essentially privileging outcomes that are closer to you, the number of boardings, walk distances, and number of destinations available. So these are the data that were produced through this process. We also looked at trying to capture some of the heterogeneity that you were talking about in terms of mobility, Dr. Jung was talking about, in a very limited way, granted. We developed 5 different models based on how fast people walk and how far they're willing to travel, which obviously varies depending on one's preferences and maybe even physical limitations. So we have models 1, which is just the private automobile going from essentially door to door. There isn't much walking involved in most of these cases. Then we use models 2 through 5 are the public transit and the walking. Model 2 and 3 assumes that, or actually model 2 and 4, and I actually present some of the results in that order, model 1, 2, 4, 3, 5. But model 1 and 2 and 4 assume a kind of average walking speed and a mile distance. So that includes maybe a half mile getting to a bus stop, which is kind of a long distance, a little more than planners plan for typically, and then a half mile at the end. So you talk about the first and last miles, it's at most 1 mile. And then models 3 and 5 assume a slower walking speed and a shorter distance, maybe a quarter mile on each end. These are the accessibility equations that we use to measure, and the only thing I'll point out here is that for the weighted job accessibility, it was essentially inversely weighted the value of employment opportunities with respect to time. So the number of opportunities is actually lower as reported than it would be just for when you're not accounting for that factor. So this is a map from one origin. You could argue that it's the highest accessibility origin for all of Kalamazoo County. It's the Kalamazoo Transportation Center. In fact, all of the 19 routes, I think all but one, go through the Transportation Center. So this is looking from one origin, how far can we get with regard to these different models. In this case, we're looking at by private automobile. So within 1 hour, you can pretty much get to every place in Kalamazoo County and even beyond. So the darker red is the 60-minute kind of threshold, and you can see we're going into neighboring counties without a problem. Whereas Model 2, when we look at and I should say that those lines is the Kalamazoo Metro Transit configuration, the 19 routes I spoke of. So this is Model 2 looking at how far can we get. 60 minutes, you can't even get to all of the public transit lines within 60 minutes. So it's a limited view, but if you add wheelchair accessibility, the account for wheelchair access and wheelchair boarding, those limitations, that is narrowed even further. So here's where, let's say we don't want to walk so much, and this is the lower walking speed, slower walking speed and shorter distance. Now this is that plus wheelchair accessibility limitation. So you see how small of an area you have accessible to you if you're if you're dependent on more enhanced infrastructure. I'm going to go over these very quickly, but you can see in terms of network utilization, the private automobile is utilizing about 100% of the Kalamazoo County street network, whereas, best case scenario, you're using 40% for public transit, all the way down to under 10%. In terms of total area of access, we're talking under 10% even for the best case scenario in public transit. Total jobs, you have about 100%, employment accessibility within 1 hour distance by private auto, whereas you're at maximum getting about 60–70% by public transit. This is now looking at not just that singular location at the transit center, but an average for each of the census, 5,785 census blocks within Kalamazoo County. And these maps are comparable. This is a series of maps. So 1,500 or more, so the red areas have the highest level of employment access. And this is Model 1, again, by car. Now we're looking at it for the best case scenario, Model 2 for public transit, Model 4 when you now consider wheelchair access, now Model 3 where you have a slower walking speed and maximum threshold distance, and then here again for the probably not the worst case scenario, but a bad case scenario in terms of our models with these slower walking speeds and minimum distance for employment accessibility. So now I have to even change the scales when we're looking at it in terms of average employment accessibility. On the right-hand vertical axis is job accessibility for Model 1, where you're reaching about 100,000 jobs, whereas for Models 2 through 5, you're at the 30,000 job accessibility using the vertical axis on the left-hand side. And you can see actually this dark black is the same model, but now here in the dashed line showing what the effects are when you consider only the stops that have wheelchair boarding platform and so on. And likewise for models 3 and 5. Let me go over these rather quickly because I think my time is starting to run out. But the next and this is one last chart that are similar, and you can see how, again, it fluctuates throughout the day depending on your starting time. And it would be, and you can see some regularity to this pattern only because it's a single system, but when systems, public transit systems begin to interact, say in larger areas, you're going to have a lot more variability. This is showing total number of boardings that are possible when you don't consider the access, whether or not there's a wheelchair boarding platform or connectivity to the sidewalk versus when you do. And you just have, even of the public transit system, a lot less utilization. Okay. The last part of it is, well, now that we have this knowledge, we know the employment, we have these rather nuanced measures of accessibility, can we prioritize maybe improvements of public transit infrastructure within Kalamazoo Metro, across the Kalamazoo Metro system? So again, where should we begin? We have 638 non-compliant stops. We had some information about costs, what it would take to retrofit the stops, as well as the alighting and boarding information for each one. We took within a quarter-mile area of each of the stops the total jobs, workers, and essentially trying to capture the travel demand within each of the stops. And we use a linear program to maximize the equation as to where to put where to retrofit. And we used a scaling factor, as I mentioned, with respect to jobs and trying to account for travel demand potential. Oh, we have a 0. Okay, good, because I'm very near done. Phasing this in, using a maximization approach. These are some average standardized impacts. In other words, average number of workers per bus stop retrofit that are impacted by that, potentially impacted by that improvement. We constrained cost to $72,000, which was essentially a fifth of the total amount estimated for the retrofitting all 600-something stops. The optimization, of course, we need something to compare it to. So we ran 5,000 random iterations to see how that optimization compares. So we're looking at estimated impacts using kind of a randomized model versus the maximization model. And I don't know if you can see these lightly colored vertical lines. That's where the optimization model would perform relative to the densities of the of the random model with 5,000 permutations. So here we're having less cost and greater impact along all of the categories. So I'll kind of end it there. That's one approach. What we're looking to do, and I should probably just mention, what is the commute mode share within Kalamazoo County for public transit? It's actually the lowest mode share of any mode. In fact, walking outperforms public transit usage by double. So they're like 1.4% using public transit versus 2.8% walking, which maybe is a good thing in some sense, but could we improve mode share by creating more accommodating infrastructure? So I'll just end there.